Egyptomania. Have you ever sat in a parlor surrounded by friends and watched as a 2,000-year-old corpse was unwrapped for your evening's entertainment? It sounds like a fever dream, doesn't it? A scene from some Gothic horror novel. And yet, for the Victorians, this was a perfectly respectable, even fashionable way to spend an evening. This was the strange, morbid pinnacle of a craze that swept across Britain like a sandstorm, a phenomenon we now call Egyptomania. It all began, as these things often do, with war and conquest. Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt at the turn of the 19th century brought back not just strategic reports, but incredible stories, sketches of towering temples and whispers of treasures beyond imagination. Soldiers returned with pockets full of scarabs and fragments of ancient pottery. Suddenly, this distant, sun-scorched land of pyramids and pharaohs was no longer a half-forgotten chapter in the Bible. It was real, it was tangible, and it was deeply, deeply fashionable. The British Museum became a treasure house, its halls filling with colossal statues of Ramesses the Great and sarcophagi plucked from the Valley of the Kings. But you see, for the Victorians, simply looking at these things wasn't enough. They were a generation that prized progress, industry, and above all, hands-on discovery. They wanted to touch, to dissect, to know. And what better way to know the ancient Egyptians than to unrolled one? Enter the surgeon and antiquarian Thomas Pettigrew. He became the master of ceremonies for this peculiar form of theater. He would acquire a mummy, often through rather dubious channels, and send out invitations to the great and the good of London society. For a guinea a ticket, you could witness the spectacle. Imagine the scene, a drawing room lit by gas lamps, men in their starched collars, women in their rustling silks, all leaning forward with bated breath. The air would be thick with anticipation, and the dry, dusty, faintly resinous smell of the ancient dead. Pettigrew, with surgical precision, would begin his work. First, the outer linen bandages, yellowed and brittle with age, would be cut away, hundreds of yards of it. With each layer removed, the tension in the room would mount. Trinkets might be discovered tucked within the folds, a small faience, amulet, a string of beads, a lucky scarab. These would be passed around the delighted audience, and then the final layers would be peeled back to reveal the body itself. A shriveled, blackened human form, 2 or 3 millennia old, now exposed to the damp London air and the curious gaze of 100 strangers. It was part science, part séance, part circus sideshow. Pettigrew would offer commentary on the embalming process, point out anatomical features, and perhaps speculate on the person's cause of death. But let's be honest with ourselves. The thrill wasn't purely academic. It was a voyeuristic dance with death. A way for a society deeply repressed and terrified of its own mortality to confront it in a controlled historical context. It was safe horror. The mummy couldn't hurt you. It was a relic, an object. And yet it had once been a person with a name, a family, a life. A life that was now being undone, layer by layer, for the amusement of a Victorian dinner party. The obsession was so pervasive that mummy brown, a rich brown pigment for artists, was literally created by grinding up ancient mummies. Think about that for a moment. Masterpieces of the age may well have a human soul mixed into their paint. It was a strange time, where the sacred and the profane, the scientific and the ghoulish, met in the middle of a London parlour, under the unseeing eyes of the long dead.
Pterodomania. From the morbid theater of the mummy party, we move to something that seems, on the surface, infinitely more gentle. Something green and quiet and quintessentially English. We move to the humble fern. And yet, the Victorian obsession with this simple plant was anything but humble. It was a mania, a fever that gripped the nation for decades, driving men and women to scale cliffs, trespass on private land, and decorate every conceivable surface of their homes with its delicate, feathery fronds. They called it pteridomania, the fern craze. It's difficult for us, in our world of instant access to any plant from any corner of the globe, to appreciate just how revolutionary the fern was to the Victorian mind. This was an age of incredible scientific discovery, yes, but it was also an age of smoke and soot and industrial grime. The cities were gray, crowded, and often unhealthy. The fern, then, represented a piece of pristine, ancient nature that you could bring into your own home. It was a miniature forest for your windowsill, a link to a wild, untamed Britain that was rapidly disappearing under a blanket of brick and iron. The craze was fueled by new technologies. The invention of the Wardian case, a kind of miniature sealed greenhouse, allowed even the most delicate ferns to survive in the polluted air of a city home. Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward discovered the principle by accident, when a moth pooper he had sealed in a glass jar sprouted a tiny fern. It was a revelation. Suddenly, a new world of horticulture was open to everyone, not just the wealthy with their vast conservatories. And so the hunt began. Armed with trowels and collecting baskets, people of all classes fanned out across the countryside. They called it ferning. It became a wildly popular hobby, especially for women. In an era where female activity was heavily restricted, ferning offered a rare taste of freedom and adventure. It was a respectable, scientific pursuit that allowed a young woman to go hiking in the woods, to climb a wind-swept moor, and to engage her mind in the complex business of botanical classification. Of course, it also had its dangers. Newspapers of the day reported on numerous accidents of fern hunters falling from ledges or being stranded by the tide in their single-minded pursuit of a rare specimen. The fern motif bled into every aspect of Victorian design. You would find it pressed into pottery, carved into wooden furniture, etched onto glass, and embroidered onto fabrics. People built dedicated ferneries in their gardens, grottos of stone and dripping water designed to replicate the plant's natural habitat. Inside the home, ferns dripped from hanging baskets and stood sentinel in ornate pots. There were fern albums, fern dioramas, even fern-themed poetry. It was an all-consuming passion. But I think the appeal ran deeper than mere decoration. The fern was a link to a prehistoric past. Geologists were uncovering fossils that showed identical ferns from millions of years ago. To look at a fern was to look into the abyss of time. It was a living fossil, a survivor from a lost world of dinosaurs and ancient forests. For a society grappling with Darwin's revolutionary ideas about the evolution and the age of the earth, the fern was a source of profound wonder and contemplation. It was a piece of eternity captured in a terracotta pot, a quiet, green rebellion against the relentless, noisy march of the modern world.
Spiritualism. As the Victorian home filled with the green shoots of ancient life, the parlour itself became the stage for a very different kind of exploration. After dark, when the curtains were drawn and the gas lamps turned down low, families would gather around the table, link hands, and wait. They were not waiting for a guest or for dinner to be served. They were waiting for a message from beyond the grave. This was the age of spiritualism, a movement that promised what so many Victorians desperately craved, proof that death was not the end. Life in the Victorian era was framed by death. Infant mortality was tragically high. Diseases like tuberculosis and cholera could snatch a loved one away with terrifying speed. And the rigid mourning rituals, with their black crape and drawn-out periods of seclusion, meant that death was a constant, visible presence. The church offered comfort, of course, but it was a comfort based on faith. Spiritualism offered something more tantalizing. It offered evidence. The movement exploded into popular consciousness from America in the 1850s, with tales of the Fox sisters and their mysterious spirit rappings. Soon, mediums were appearing all across Britain, offering their services as intermediaries between the living and the dead. Séances became a fashionable, if controversial, pastime. A typical séance was a carefully stage-managed piece of theater. The medium, often a young woman, would sit at the center of the circle. The room would be plunged into darkness, save for a single candle. A hush would fall. Then the phenomena would begin. A table might begin to tilt and knock, seemingly of its own accord, rapping out messages from the spirit world. One knock for yes, two for no. Disembodied hands, made of a strange, ethereal substance called ectoplasm, might appear from behind a curtain to touch a sitter's cheek. Musical instruments, like accordions or trumpets, would float around the room, playing ghostly melodies. And sometimes the medium herself would channel a spirit, her voice changing as she delivered messages of comfort and reassurance from a departed husband or a lost child. It's easy for us to dismiss this all as fraud, and indeed much of it was. Mediums were masters of illusion, using hidden wires, accomplices, and clever sleight of hand to produce their spooky effects. Ectoplasm was often just cheesecloth swallowed and regurgitated. But to simply label it all as a hoax is to miss the point. The sitters in that dark room were not fools. They were intelligent, often highly educated people, doctors, lawyers, scientists. Even Queen Victoria herself was said to have held séances at Buckingham Palace after the death of her beloved Prince Albert. These people wanted to believe. They were grieving. They were desperate for a sign that their loved ones were safe and happy in the summerland, as the spiritualists called the afterlife. And in that darkened room, in that shared atmosphere of hope and expectation, they found it. The desire for connection was so strong that it could bend reality, transforming a creak of the floorboards into a message from a lost father, or a gust of wind into the whisper of a dead child. Spiritualism shone a light on the deep anxieties of the Victorian soul. It was a reaction against the cold, hard materialism of the industrial age. It was a rebellion against the finality of death. In a world that was becoming ever more scientific and rational, the séance was a small, dark pocket of magic and mystery, a place where, for a few precious hours, the iron laws of nature could be suspended, and a conversation, comforting and perhaps even propulsive, was possible.
Floriography. In a society as famously repressed as the Victorian era, how did one express the deepest passions of the heart? How could you declare your undying love, your burning jealousy, or your quiet despair when the rules of etiquette forbade any open display of emotion? You did it with flowers. You spoke a silent, beautiful, and incredibly complex language, a language of petals and stems known as floriography. Giving a bouquet of flowers was not a simple gesture. It was the sending of a coded message, a floral telegram that could be read and understood by any well-educated person. Dozens of floral dictionaries were published, each one listing hundreds of plants and their associated meanings. To the uninitiated, a small posy, known as a tussie-mussy, was just a pretty collection of blooms. To a Victorian lady, it was a letter to be deciphered. The system was astonishingly nuanced. A red rose, of course, meant passionate love. But a yellow rose could signify jealousy or a decrease in affection. A white lily represented purity and virtue, while a tiger lily spoke of wealth and pride. Even the most common garden flowers were loaded with meaning. A simple pansy meant thoughts. A sprig of ivy meant fidelity. And a humble daisy, innocence. But the complexity didn't stop there. The way the flowers were presented added further layers of grammar. If a flower was given upside down, it meant the opposite of its usual meaning. A rosebud, with its thorns still attached, meant, I fear, but I hope. If the ribbon tying the tussie-mussy was tied to the left, the message applied to the giver. If tied to the right, it applied to the recipient. A full, open confession could be made without a single word being spoken. Imagine a young suitor forbidden from speaking his heart to the lady he adores. He could send her a bouquet containing a red camellia, you are a flame in my heart, a sprig of honeysuckle, devoted affection, and a touch of fern, sincerity. She, in turn, could send back a single yellow carnation, disdain, crushing his hopes entirely. Or, perhaps, she might send a spray of apple blossom, preference, signaling her interest. It was a delicate, high-stakes conversation conducted entirely through the medium of botany. This floral code was a direct product of the strict social constraints of the time. It was a beautiful, creative workaround, a way for human emotion to flourish in a restrictive environment. It allowed for a kind of romantic, plausible deniability. If a gentleman's intentions were questioned, he could always claim it was just a simple gift of flowers, with no hidden meaning intended. The language of flowers was a secret garden in the heart of a rigid and formal world. It was a testament to the human need to connect, to express, and to love, even when the rules of society try to build walls around the heart. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful messages are the ones that are never spoken aloud, but are simply felt, understood, and held in the hand like a fragile, fragrant promise. The cult of mourning. Death, as we've discussed, was an ever-present reality for the Victorians. But their relationship with it was far more than simple acceptance. It was an elaborate, theatrical, and often obsessive performance. After the death of her husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, Queen Victoria plunged herself into a state of perpetual mourning that would last for the remaining 40 years of her life. She set the tone for the entire nation, and the cult of mourning, with its intricate rules and strange customs, became one of the most defining obsessions of the age. When a death occurred in a household, a strict and unforgiving set of rituals was immediately put into motion. The curtains were drawn, clocks were stopped at the time of death, and mirrors were covered with black cloth, lest the spirit of the deceased be trapped inside. Wreaths of yew or boxwood, tied with black ribbon, were hung on the front door to announce the family's loss to the world. For the women of the family, the rules were particularly draconian. A widow was expected to enter a period of full mourning for at least 2 years.
During the first year and a day, she was to wear only black, non-reflective fabrics like bombazine and crepe. Her costume was all-encompassing, from her black bonnet and veil to her black gloves and jet jewelry. She was expected to live in near total seclusion, withdrawing from all social events and entertainments. To do otherwise would be a sign of profound disrespect to her late husband. As time went on, the rules would relax in stages, from full mourning to half mourning, where colors like gray, mauve, and lilac could be gradually reintroduced. But the entire process was a public performance of grief, and society was a harsh judge. A widow who came out of mourning too soon, or who wore the wrong shade of purple, would be subject to vicious gossip and social ostracism. This obsession created a booming industry. Entire shops, known as mourning warehouses, sprang up to cater to every funereal need. They sold ready-made mourning clothes, special black-edged stationery for writing letters of condolence, an incredible array of morbid keepsakes. Perhaps the strangest of these were the memento mori, reminders of death. Post-mortem photography became common, where families would pose with their recently deceased loved ones, particularly children, as if they were merely sleeping. It seems ghoulish to us, but for a family who might have no other image of their child, it was a precious, if heartbreaking, final memory. Even more intimate was the creation of hair jewelry. Locks of the deceased's hair would be intricately woven into bracelets, brooches, and rings, often under a small glass panel. It was a way of keeping a physical part of the person you had lost with you, always. This deep, public immersion in the aesthetics of death may seem alien to us. We tend to hide our grief, to medicalize death, and keep it behind closed doors. The Victorians externalized it. They gave their sorrow a uniform, a timetable, and a set of social rules. In a way, it may have been a coping mechanism. By turning grief into a shared public ritual, they gave it structure and meaning. It was a way of navigating the overwhelming chaos of loss. The cult of mourning was not just an obsession with death, it was an obsession with memory, a desperate black-clad attempt to keep the ones they had lost from truly disappearing into the silence of the past.
The freak show. In an age that prized conformity and rigid social norms, there was a strange and powerful fascination with the exact opposite, the unique, the atypical, the so-called freak of nature. The Victorian freak show was not a hidden back-alley affair. It was mainstream entertainment, a place where, for the price of a penny, the public could gaze upon people who defied all normal expectations of the human form. Men like the legendary P.T. Barnum made fortunes by exhibiting these human curiosities. His American Museum in New York and his touring shows that came to Britain were wildly successful. He presented figures like General Tom Thumb, a charismatic and intelligent man with dwarfism, who became an international celebrity, even performing for Queen Victoria. There were the Siamese twins Chang and Eng Bunker, joined at the sternum, who lived a full life, married 2 sisters, and fathered 21 children between them. The roster of performers was as varied as it was sensational. There were giants and dwarfs, bearded ladies like Madame Josephine Clofullia, and human skeletons like Isaac Sprague, who suffered from extreme progressive muscular atrophy. There were also those whose acts were based less on a physical condition and more on a constructed, often fictitious persona. The wild men of Borneo were actually two brothers with dwarfism from Ohio. The Circassian beauties, with their huge frizzy hair, were presented as escaped slaves from a Turkish harem, embodying a very specific Victorian fantasy of the exotic and the forbidden. What drove this obsession? On one level, it was simple, raw curiosity. In an era before television or the internet, the freak show offered a glimpse of things that seemed impossible. It was a visual feast of the unbelievable. But there was a deeper, more complex psychology at play. For the scientists and doctors of the day, these performers were objects of intense medical interest. They represented the outer limits of human biology. They were living, breathing case studies to be measured, documented, and debated in the pages of medical journals. For a society obsessed with categorizing and understanding the natural world, human anomalies were the final, most fascinating frontier. For the audience, the experience was a mixture of horror, pity, and a strange sense of reassurance. By gazing upon someone who was so visibly different, the normal viewer could feel a sense of relief and superiority. It reinforced their own sense of belonging to the mainstream. The freak show, in a bizarre way, helped to define what it meant to be normal by showcasing its absolute antithesis. But we must not forget the performers themselves. We risk seeing them only as victims, as exploited objects of a cruel public gaze. And while exploitation was certainly rampant, it is not the whole story. For many of these individuals, the freak show was the only viable way to earn a living, and in many cases, a very good one. It offered them a degree of independence and financial security that would have been impossible in the outside world. Many, like General Tom Thumb, became savvy business people and wealthy celebrities in their own right. They were agents in their own lives, not just passive exhibits. They took control of their own narrative. And in a world that sought to marginalize them, they found a way to take center stage. The freak show holds up a strange and distorted mirror to the Victorian age. It reflects their scientific curiosity, their colonial attitudes, their obsession with classification, and their deep-seated anxiety about what it meant to be human.
The Panic of Spring-Heeled Jack. Our final obsession takes us out of the parlours and the theatres and onto the dark, gaslit streets of London. It is an obsession born not of collecting or social ritual, but of pure, unadulterated fear. It is the story of a monster, a phantom, a villain who for decades haunted the imagination of the nation. He was known as Spring-Heeled Jack. The first sightings began in the late 1830s. The stories were strange, fragmented, and terrifying. People, most often young women, reported being attacked by a bizarre figure. The descriptions were outlandish, almost supernatural. He was said to be tall and thin, with a terrifying devilish appearance, clawed hands, eyes that glowed like red-hot coals, and the ability to breathe a jet of blue and white flame from his mouth. But his most defining characteristic, the one that gave him his name, was his incredible ability to leap. Witnesses claimed he could bound over high walls and leap from the ground to the rooftops in a single, effortless spring.
He would appear out of the darkness, attack his victims, often by ripping at their clothes with his claws, and then vanish as quickly as he came, leaving behind a state of terror and confusion. In one famous case, a young woman named Jane Alsop answered her door to a man claiming to be a policeman. When she brought him a candle, he revealed his hideous appearance and attacked her, spitting fire and tearing at her with his metallic claws. Her screams brought her family, but the attacker simply bounded away into the night. The press, of course, had a field day. The legend of Spring-Heeled Jack spread like wildfire. He became a boogeyman for the industrial age, a terrifying fixture of Victorian folklore. Was he a demon, a ghost, a madman, or a prankster with a twisted sense of humor and some very clever contraptions hidden in his boots? The panic ebbed and flowed for years. Sightings were reported all across the country. He became a character in the cheap, sensationalist magazines known as penny dreadfuls, transforming from a mysterious assailant into a full-blown anti-hero, a nobleman by day and a caped terror by night. He was, in a sense, one of the world's first urban legends. The obsession with Spring-Heeled Jack reveals the anxieties of a society in rapid chaotic change. The cities were growing at an incredible rate, becoming vast, anonymous places filled with dark alleys and shadowy corners where anything could happen. The traditional rural bogeyman of folklore didn't fit this new urban landscape. The Victorians needed a new kind of monster, a monster of the city. Spring-Heeled Jack was the perfect fit. He was often described as wearing the clothes of a gentleman, a terrifying fusion of high society and bestial violence. He represented the fear that civilization was just a thin veneer, and that underneath the top hats and corsets, a dark, primal chaos was waiting to erupt. No one was ever caught. No definitive explanation was ever found. Spring-Heeled Jack was not a single person, most likely. He was a hysteria, a shared nightmare given a name and a shape. He was the embodiment of the fear of the dark, the fear of the stranger, the fear of the city itself. He was the monster that the Victorian age, with all its progress and its piety, secretly felt it deserved. A final strange obsession in an empire of oddities.